UK. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all here today for our talk looking at the opportunities behind post-COVID and what we can be doing as startups and scale-ups to actually take advantage of the opportunities after that. I have a fantastic guest who's here to join me today, Jerome Joaug, who's the partner at Aster Capital. Jerome, it is a pleasure to have you here. How are you doing today?
Very well. How about you?
All good, all good. I think not quite as much sunshine today, but it's nice to at least get a bit of brightness, which is always good. Could you tell us a little bit about Aster? Tell us a little bit about yourself. Where are you coming from?
Yeah, sure. So before joining the VC side, I was an entrepreneur myself. So I had the chance to sell two businesses, to found and sell two businesses. So the first one was Cambridge Spinout. It was a company which was making nanomaterials to improve lithium-ion batteries. So I sold this company in 2016 and then created another one in IoT, a software for IoT devices to allow them to update their software but without consuming any battery. So if you think about your phone, every time you replace, you update the OS, it consumes half of the battery. For IoT devices, obviously that's not possible. So we had that, and so that second company I sold it to Arm in 2018, and that's when, after my transition period, I joined Aster. So Aster, we're one of the major French VC, but we have offices in London as well, and San Francisco and Tel Aviv, so quite international. And one specificity of the fund is that we are focused on industrial areas such as energy, transportation, and overall like what we call like Industry 4.0. So what's looking at the future of all of our industrial sectors, how they digitize, how they adopt AI, etc., robotics. So quite different varieties of topic, but focused on industrial sectors.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much, Jerome. And I think, that understanding of both sides of the fence, I think, is obviously always really useful. And I know we have sort of companies who are part of sort of our Microsoft for startups, our B2B support, who you support as well. So it's really fantastic to have this conversation. Now, the past few months have been a bit tumultuous, I think, to say the least, right? Especially as small companies, you know this better than anyone else. Building a company at the best of times is a tricky endeavor, let alone trying to do that in the middle of a global pandemic. I know you've been obviously supporting a lot of your companies, trying to make sure that they have the right tools that they need to kind of keep going through the following months. I know we've been having a lot of conversations with the startups in our support community as well. But I guess if we kick off maybe with thinking about what are those startups, what are those scale-up areas that might have been sort of hit by these sort of world-changing incidents. Where do you think the opportunities are? Who do you think is going to have it easier, harder? What does that sort of complicated picture look like from your side?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very broad question because I guess that's the question everyone wants is wondering right now. I think like in general, I mean, there are two aspects to the answer. One answer is obviously there are some sectors who are more, let's say, favored than others. All the digital companies, logistic, e-commerce, etc. Like anything that actually went through the lockdown period but didn't. I mean, most of them even had a positive impact. So these are obviously the sectors who are coming out very strong. But also, if you look at specific sectors, there are some sort of sub-segments which are. I mean, overall sectors are like. Really, let's say, we're going into a financial economic crisis. Right? So it's a crippled economy, but you have some sort of glimmers of hope in specific segments. So I just take one example, like in automotive, for instance. Obviously, like there was like 80% drop in car sales like for 2 months. So it was like basically the industry was completely stopped. But during the same period, you see like the number of electric car sales doubling, for instance, right? So this is like something really, really interesting, like overall. So, but most of the sectors are like this. So like overall, the sectors are quite hit, but there are some sub-segments which are actually developing in a, let's say, surprising manner. But overall, like I think like if we look at the startups in general, those who are really favored, let's say, I mean, during lockdown, but also in the next few months, I would say, is really, I mean, unsurprisingly, future of work. I mean, like as Microsoft, as Teams, these type of tools really like boomed during those months. But maybe I can also talk something a bit different. So like for instance, we are looking a lot at digitization of blue collar work. So it's a segment that not many startups have been targeting, but actually some startups have been getting a lot of momentum during that period. And that's simply due to the fact that it's a class of population that innovation didn't really take off for a very long time, and we saw like suddenly that actually wait, they are critical people as well, even more during lockdown. And so like now after lockdown, we actually see a lot of enterprises like large corporates adopting this type of tools, although before it wasn't a priority at all. Related to that, there's also anything related to HR tech, so to keep organization flexible. Also, a lot of tools related to just to help managers being better managers, right? I think a lot of people, I mean, there are not many good managers. That's a well-known fact across people who manage teams. That's a very well-known fact. But the thing is, a lot of them now have faced situations where they just didn't know to handle. And there were a lot of tools again, which was seen as nice to have, but suddenly becomes like a must have in many organizations. And so yes, another obvious one is like cloud and IT infrastructure. So a lot of trends which were already ongoing, but which have been accelerated now by the crisis. And one which not quite sure yet, but since like one of our key sectors is renewables and energy. We do believe that it will have ultimately a positive impact on sustainability and energy transition. This, as such, is a topic on its own because it's actually a complex question. We're still studying that very carefully, but we see mainly a shift in consumer demand. So corporates, clearly, a lot of them wants to get rid of the rules, and some governments, you don't know what they do. But from a consumer perspective, really see an acceleration of sort of like improvement of on consumers' behavior, which is obviously a big opportunity for startups.
Yeah, and I think that there is definitely that difference in picture between the B2C sort of world and the B2B world. What would you suggest as far as there are certain B2C areas which have boomed? You look at online e-commerce, especially around sort of the food sectors and these types of things, and even when we look at the restaurant sector, some of them have taken huge leaps as far as adoption of technology and how they kind of look at those pictures. What would you say to any startups, scale-ups who are operating in B2C sectors and maybe in some of those sectors which were harder hit, so like food, like travel and tourism? Are there any things that you would see as being opportunities post-COVID for them? Will things return to normal, or are they sort of actually they're needing to really think carefully about their products and how they connect to their customers even more so than they did before?
Yeah, I mean, is that going to return to normal? I'm not, good enough to say, because the thing is, like, it really depends on like how let's say phase 2 of the epidemic is going to be handled, and that varies hugely from country to country, because the virus is still there, and you see, I mean, very clearly, some people just want to get back their normal life, but they are actually a minority. If we look at the figures, etc., and just the crowd which is outside, basically, you have another category of population which would, come back to a normal life, but keep all the rules, the safety rules, distanciation, mask, etc. And you have those who would be scared and who would, do nothing, probably still stay at home for some time. And the thing is, depending on how long this period lasts, that's when habits would actually kick in, So if it's only a few weeks or a few months, people would probably come back to old habits straight away, start taking planes again, going to the other side of the world, traveling. If it lasts for too long, probably they would find other habits, right? And I think like the most important for startups in those fields is that the key here is really customer segmentation. So understand in a very sort of detailed manner, like who your customers are. Let's say by age class, by geography, by habits, whatever. because they are going to sort of react in a different way, right? And if we take an example of Airbnb, for instance, I mean, right now their business is completely destroyed, right? Because people cannot travel. But if you see like a few months ahead, they do have bookings. I mean, some people want to travel. Obviously, it's probably 20% of what it was before, but it's still good to take. But the important thing for them is that they see people travel more locally. They don't want to travel too far, so that changes a lot in the way the renters are going to work for them. So I think a company like this, I mean, they have all the data, so it's easier for them. But if they really understand these mechanisms that are at work, they can try to have more renters for local accommodation. Stop a bit the development of the farther travel, etc. So that's the way to go, basically.
And I think that really sort of brings up that point where one of the things which has happened over the past few months is this real polarization of success in the market, right? Some businesses are booming, whereas others have basically had to shut down and unfortunately have to furlough staff, struggling financially, all of these types of things. Talking about, I guess, and I think this is to Aster's sort of footprint as a sort of a European VC as well. Are you finding that the landscapes are very different across the different European countries? What would you say to any company who's maybe looking at expanding into neighboring markets within Europe? Is now a time, should you even think about expansion, or is it more around solidifying your base, or is it just very much down to the company and I guess where they are with their sales and their pipeline at the time?
Yeah, so it really depends on companies, obviously, because, I mean, when you say, some businesses are booming, I mean, from the figures we have, it's about 5 to 8% startups who actually got a positive impact. So it's by far not the majority, right? Yeah. Most startups are not in a strong position. And I think the other aspect is also, I mean, in the UK, I don't have the figures, but for instance, in France, most startups went through the lockdown and survived the lockdown period because of the government measures, but a lot of it are loans, right? So this means that, yes, they survived the lockdown, but the few, let's say 6 months or like 1 year ahead, they will have much more debt than they should have, which is like for a startup, which is not necessarily profitable, like that is definitely not good, right? So let's say it's only spreading and kicking the problem in the future. So they are not entirely safe yet. So I think like in this type of situation is really, I would say the advice is more to solidify the existing business, and as well, obviously like caring about the cash, etc. Now, if there is a possible new fundraise like this, makes things a bit different. But I would say most startups would probably try to solidify the existing business. Yeah. Now, the thing is, it's not to say that the opposite shouldn't be considered. A lot of startups save themselves because they look at new customer segment that they were not serving before. In food, for instance, I mean, I've seen startup. In fact, like, there's one startup in my Angel portfolio. They went from B2B to B2C entirely. Wow. within the space of a few weeks, they just developed several features that they were planning to do in 2 years or something, but they reprioritized because they realized that in the short term, in fact, they had no choice but just to completely pivot their business, because people who are eating in restaurants, they still eat. It's just they eat at home. So you need to get them in another way, right? So this type of, I mean, I wouldn't call that expansion, but I would say like adaptation, pivot. These are like really important to do, and even in the next few months, it's really important to keep sort of doing that and identify the opportunities within the general sectors, and then obviously, I mean, the startups who end up in a good position with not too much debt, with still the ability of fundraise, there's no reason why they shouldn't expand as I would say as planned. Just keeping in mind that we're likely to go into an economic recession, but for new trends, usually these are not that impacted. So.
And I think picking up on actually that point around your company who pivoted, within the food sector. Thinking generally about, I guess, innovation, and this is obviously, the backbone of any startup is to innovate and do something and be disruptive. how do companies approach innovation post-COVID? Would you recommend that companies are still looking to sort of, innovate and do new things, or if they've got sort of, customer base, should they just solidify that and kind of stick with things? What do you think is the appetite for innovation sort of going to be like?
So do you mean like companies as of startup customers, or like, yeah,
the startups themselves, and kind of thinking that they
yeah,
should be sort of, doing new things, I guess?
Yeah, so I mean, the first sort of answer, if we look at history, is that innovation and in general, like, productivity gains, etc., never stop even during crisis. Right? So you can look at 2000, 2008, etc. Like a lot of a lot of investors just left. They had no money left to invest. They got hit themselves quite well, but innovation just keeps its pace and keeps going. So I think that's one part of the answer, and I think it's even more true for this crisis, because the COVID crisis has really highlighted a lot of aspects of our society that don't work. And so there's actually a lot of things to do. First, to just restart, and second, to actually prepare for the next phase and make sure that something like this doesn't happen. So definitely, I think a lot of this innovation is going to come from startups. And I think a lot of countries recognize it, even with like countries who are in Europe in particular, who are not that developed in terms of entrepreneurship. If we take Italy, for instance, we're creating a team in Italy next year because the government has just unleashed a lot of sort of initiatives to create, or like to strengthen and develop their local startup market, because they've recognized the fact that the old industry has done as much as they could. They can still do better, but it will be few percent improvement over the next 10 years. But startups, that's the only thing that can actually bring new stuff, right? On the other side, the corporates, so it's always a trade-off between cutting R&D, because they will cut costs. Most of them, like especially in manufacturing, they hit quite hard. But at the same time, the example I gave, for instance, for the in automotive is like, okay, but my customer wants electric cars, so should I cut R&D because this is a cost, or should I actually keep it going because that's what customer want, right? And a lot of companies, we see a bit of this sort of, not really a dilemma, because ultimately they should go towards the customer, right? So yeah, in a word, like, it won't stop for sure, even if the global ecosystem would be obviously in like going through a difficult period.
Yeah. And I think that sort of raises a really interesting question about, is this going to be a good time to even start a company? Thinking about how the world is different, thinking about, what might be different going forwards. Would you say that there is an opportunity for people who maybe hadn't considered sort of entrepreneurship to sort of look at the world and go, actually, these are the problems that we're looking to solve? And your point around times of difficulty often being great drivers of innovation, I think, is really valid there. What would be your thoughts around that? Is it a good time to start a startup?
So I don't know if it's a good time, but definitely people would start company. And I just give you like like the whole fintech industry, like fintech in startup, a lot of them were created after 2008 because people had no job in finance anymore, right? So I think what we see happening right now, it's a bit of the same. So a lot of people who just, it has already started, but a lot of people are going to lose their job. That's quite a big problem, but that's a reality. And a portion of them will actually create startup based on problems that they have seen in their own industry. And I think, last time it happened, it created, entire new opportunities. And here we think that the same would happen as well. And if you look at the different startup ecosystem, it's actually not drive like the way London developed, or in UK, like Cambridge, Oxford, or like in the US, or in like Paris, Berlin. The way that developed is not a problem of funding. It's never funding that creates a startup ecosystem. It's always the switch of talents. First, the pool of talents locally. And on top of that, the switch of talents going from, going to work for big corporates and then transitioning to startups. That's always what triggered, I would say, the boom of the local ecosystem. So I think, like, in this crisis, the same is going to happen. A lot of people are going to transition from corporate to startups. And that would definitely create a lot of startups. Now, is it a good time? it's going to be a tough time, but not actually. I mean, we don't think it's going to be as tough as 2008 because so in 2000 it was the same in 2000 or 2008. It's like post-crisis in Europe, all the VC disappeared because I mean funds. It's not that they had no money left. Some funds died, and even the strong fund they had to support a lot of their portfolio. We think that for 2020 it's slightly different because a lot of funds managed to raise before the crisis, and now post-crisis, I mean we see the same as well because we right now we're raising 3 funds in parallel, and we see that a lot of LPs, which are like investors of us, they are still there. I mean, some are gone for sure, but a bit like startup, we see some opportunities, in a generally degraded ecosystem, basically. For instance, a lot of LPs who care about diversity, sustainability, energy, etc. In fact, they are even more active now because they do believe that there are more opportunities. So for us, we would definitely raise our next fund. And in general, some VCs would do as well, right? So there would be definitely less mortality than last time, than 2008. But overall, we probably should expect, 30% drop in funding available probably for 2020 or 2021. So yeah, it's a difficult time, but definitely the best projects, they would definitely find funding.
Yeah, and I think that's a really great segue. Actually, we'll go to talk onto the funding part, but also for any guests who are joining us today, if you've got any questions, we will have time for Q&A at the end as well. So feel free to put your questions into the chat windows as well, and our team will pick those up. And I guess as those are happening, Jerome, if we go on to the funding side, this is your bread and butter, right? This is where you put your time and effort, where you spend your days. When we think about sort of funding in the current environments, and you've had conversations with your companies who you're already invested into, those of who are thinking about follow-on funding. We've been having lots of conversations from our companies who've been looking to raise money, and it's a really mixed picture. Some of them are sort of thinking actually we're desperate, we need money now. Others, what they are saying is actually we're not desperate, let's hold for a little while. What are you seeing as, I guess, the trends as far as what the funding picture is like now versus what you anticipate will be the best sort of picture as far as startups in the future? Are they still, should they hold off for raising a round post investment, or is there still money to be spent?
Yeah, I mean, the first aspect is so during the lockdown period, a lot of funds were closed. I mean, not closed, but basically focusing on their own portfolio companies. Some of them were also in an even tougher situation because their own investor couldn't release the money because they were themselves in trouble. Right? I mean, most of the investors from VC funds, they also have investment in other areas. And, like when you get hit by a crisis like this, a lot of them just, can't release money anymore. So VC funds just don't have ways to actually deploy money. I think some funds, I mean, which funds are going to be like, which funds are so like if you look at the lockdown period, I think across Europe is probably 10% of funds who are active. So really not a lot. And most of them for the same reason, which is, we need to care about the portfolio startups. We need to review all the portfolio models, all the financial forecasts of everything to actually see if we can invest again in new opportunities in a few months. Now, for us, but also for others who are actually starting to invest again now. And I think, I mean, I don't have exact figures, but my feeling just talking to other VCs around me is probably, 30-40% of VCs starting to come back online right now. What we're really looking at is, to understand, okay, what are the next topic? What are the post-COVID trends? Because everything has changed, right? So we always, in our fund, we do a lot of work studying the trends, the different sectors that we operate in, and sort of to identify the best timing for given startups. All of our investment thesis, we just put everything in the bin and restart everything from scratch during the past 4 weeks. Like my team has been nearly working full time on this to really understand, okay, what are the next interesting things to invest in. And I think for startups, like a lot of them are in a similar situation. So they're really trying to reinvent themselves to basically be relevant in the post-COVID world. So I think like as of now, I mean, for us, our companies, so we pause them for, I mean, in terms of fundraising, we kind of pause them for about 2 to 3 months. some of them we've decided, depending on the situation. So, some startups, we feel that, so it's not good for startups to raise when they're desperate, because it's not like VCs, they are really funding the vision and the long-term growth. If in the short term, the startup is actually desperate and wants to raise money just because they are short of cash, that's really not the model for VC funds, right? So usually that doesn't work anyway. So a lot of our startups, I mean, they apply to the government support. Sometimes we bridged ourselves, but we usually to buy a few months to extend the runway. And then depending on the startup situation, those who actually manage to restart, who actually have good traction in general, we're actually starting to fundraise now. Others who need a bit more time to prepare for a good Series A or Series B, we're more, getting them another maybe 6 months to look at fundraising, probably like end of the year or like Q1 to 2021.
That's super helpful. And I guess, putting on, with your investor hat on, do startups will they need to approach preparing for investment any differently post-COVID? Is there, and I guess this is almost sort of, starting to think about, is, for example, our investors looking for greater financial runway? Would they be expecting, more traction as far as customers already sort of, onboarded, or, will there be different things, or are we talking about good principles of raising investment are still valid afterwards?
So I would say most of it would remain the same, but few exceptions, which are, let's say, aspects that we are maybe being more careful on. We're basically less likely to fund startups who have absolutely no business model, for instance. I mean, it happens sometimes in seed, especially in deep tech, when companies are still working on the product and the tech, and don't care much about the business in the first phase. These type of investment are going to be more and more difficult for us to do, because we know that once they have built the tech, the next investors is already going to look at the business side. So if the business side is not sort of taken into account from the beginning, we know that if we invest down the line 18 months, it's going to be actually much harder than before. Right? So definitely not necessarily company who have traction. We're not necessarily looking at more traction than before, but we're definitely looking at much stronger proposal in terms of the business side. Much more consideration to understanding your customers, having a model that can work, which is aligned with the value that you generate for your customers. All of those aspects are going to be much more important for us. These are things that we were already looking before, but we would be even looking at more like for early stage startups who usually don't necessarily have a stable business model. So that's one really important aspect. And I think like on the aspect, I mean, I still see some startups now who present exactly the same pitch as pre-lockdown. That's like totally a no-go. Like startups who just went through the phase and just postpone everything by 3 months because the lockdown was 3 months. I think like we expect a lot of startups to really put into question like everything they've done up to now, to really ask themselves, okay, like is our value proposition still relevant now? Still relevant in 6 months, 12 months, etc. We're really looking at this type of reflection from the founders.
Yeah, and I guess thinking about even from the Microsoft for Startup side, we're not likely to be in the office much this year, right? If we do end up back in the towards the autumn winter time, how much we actually do in person will, I think, be very low. Are you still anticipating from the investment side? Are you still going to be continuing to get people to pitch virtually? And are there any sort of tips you would give companies around how is that different? What should be different in a virtual pitch versus a sort of an in-person pitch?
Yeah, so I mean, for us, we're going to invest remotely because for the simple reason that there's no choice. If we don't do that, we won't invest until the end of the year. But I mean, there are a few challenges because the first aspect is really like we do a lot of team assessments. I mean, the first question we ask ourselves is that can we work with those founders, right? Remotely, honestly, like behind the screen, it's slightly more difficult. So the way we do it is that companies that when we're interested and we're actually likely to spend time to invest, we're going to spend much more time with the team than before. in particular, like trying to start working with them on specific projects, because I mean, some companies, when we see them, they're still working on their pricing model, right? So we actually spend time working on the pricing model with them. So that's really the way we're doing now. Obviously, like pre-lockdown, there was a lot of VC out there, a lot of money. So, sometimes you need to give a term sheet in 2 weeks. There's no way you do that. But now it's not the case. So at the same time, it gives us as well the time to actually know the founders better, but all done remotely. So that's actually quite important for us. The other aspect is also, it's much harder to sort of get a vibe about how the team works together. Because usually, like on remotely, you just don't see how people interact with each other, right? So that's for me personally, that's actually probably the hardest part of remote investment. So for that, we're doing actually quite a lot of interviews to actually see like a lot of questions about their management's style, etc., to see how the team works. And also, we even talk more, not just to the founders, but also sometimes to the first few employees to really sort of understand deeper how the organization is built and how it works together. So to me, this is the biggest difficulty. The rest, I mean, most of the due diligence can be done remotely. A lot of customer code, the expert that we get in, sometimes code review, all of this can be done remotely. For hardware, if we need to see a demonstrator, etc., that's a bit harder. Still haven't found the solution yet, but it's like these are the different aspects basically.
Yeah, I guess a lot of sort of YouTube videos and stuff like that to see how things are playing with the hardware.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think that point around what you're going to be doing differently. You're going to be spending more time actually on trying to understand teams, and I guess more one-on-one conversations. You're slowing down, I think, the process. It sounds like rather than quick term sheets, spending more time getting to know things. Are there any other things that you would say? If you're looking at sort of the VC industry, how has this changed your thinking? And I guess not just around the operational habits of VCs, but having gone through such a big crisis, are you evaluating companies differently? Does evaluating for resilience become more important?
So, I mean, there are two questions there. Like the first aspect is, are we changing fundamentally the way we operate? I think it's more an adaptation to so for instance, do we have to invest in remote? Yes. So yes, we need to adapt. So it's really a question of adaptation. When you say, like, for instance, slowing down the investment process, this is similar. It's like, I mean, usually if you want to make a good investment, you need time to evaluate the opportunity. So there's no things as such as quick investment. The only reason it was quick, and we were the same, like the reason we had to go quick is because there's very high competition, a lot of funds out there, and the best opportunity is just, get funded very quickly, right? Which is, I mean, right now not the case. So we're taking the time, but it's more like just, doing our job properly, if I may say. Really going through the evaluation of the opportunity, the understanding of the team, the understanding of the business, the understanding of the market. So I think overall, for us, we end up finalizing investment with a much better understanding of what the team is doing, how they're operating, etc. So I think, like, maybe for startups it's a challenge because yes, investment takes more time, but in general, most startups takes still 3-4 months to raise. So this doesn't really change for us. When I say like slowing down, it's more like extending by a few weeks, not extending by 6 months. But definitely for us, it really helps post investment to actually support our startups because we just know them much better. Right? So that's one positive aspect for us that I've been able to see in the past few weeks. But otherwise, I think in general, as I said, like the other aspect in terms of the adaptation is that there will be much less funding available. And also, most investors are going to think much more and run their analysis much more, and not just invest in things that they don't really understand, which happened a lot, like in 2018-19, for instance.
Yeah, and I think that sort of slight sort of not slowing down and sort of reflection of things, I think it's not just around investment. I think that's all of us, isn't it? Sort of thinking a little bit more carefully about things, taking time to make those decisions. And I guess that kind of leads me on to sort of that point around resilience, around how things will be different, and the types of companies who will survive the current conditions. And what do you think might be some of the lessons that these companies will have learned? And if you're thinking about advice to any of the startups and scale-ups on the phone, what are the kind of things that you think it's important for them to think about, how they have kind of managed and might want to take some of those lessons going forwards post-COVID?
I mean, one aspect which is really common to every single startup is to have a really, let's say, really good management practice. I know startups who, I mean, they probably won't die, but it's like now that, I mean, in most countries in Europe now, the lockdown is starting to release and people are coming back to the office. They actually see employees leaving, which is quite surprising considering the fact that you think, okay, wait, it's economic downturn, you should just stick to your job and not. But no, it's like some startups are losing 10, 15, 20% of their employees like suddenly, which is quite unusual. And this is because people just didn't like working with those companies during the lockdown, right? And I think and I see a lot with my founders as well, those who just if we forget 1 second the cash position and the nature of the business, the founders who just went through the crisis not perfectly but nearly, are those who were really good managers, who cared about the people, who cared about the mental aspect, who cared about the company culture, etc. So I think this is something definitely that would stay. I mean, maybe it's a hope, but at least in a lot of startup, people realized how those aspects were important. And so I hope a lot of founders are going forward, they would also care about that, let's say in a more normal situation.
And it's a really valuable point, and I'd love to dig into that a bit further. But also just sort of thinking about, I guess, some of those other things. So, I'm guessing for a lot of these startups, and especially, former entrepreneur myself, you keep an eye, on your burn, you keep an eye on your finances. I guess those kinds of things around sort of financial diligence and just making sure that you really, watch your burn rate, that becomes even more critical. And I guess, hopefully a lot of the companies who will survive this will, I guess, have a deeper understanding of how they might need to prepare, in a future crisis. Because, whilst it would be nice for us to be able to say that, this will end in 3 months' time, we don't know. And we don't know, might something else hit? I mean, I think looking at the US landscape and global landscape, none of us saw the Black Lives Matter sort of uprising over recent months following the George Floyd death. So all of these kinds of things are things which impact, I guess, a business's success. And how do companies think about that? What else do they look at to prepare for those types of things in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Just again, these are two different aspects. One aspect that you just mentioned is the financial aspects, or financial planning, etc. I forgot to mention that because earlier you also asked if we are looking more at the resilience aspect. So I wouldn't call that exactly resilience, but I just give you an example. So a lot of startups who are in a growth or scale up phase, they get 10 million funding, 20 million funding, whatever. They just recruit an army of sales and, they just go out. And then it may fail, it may not fail. This has been the practice for a few years already because funding was, widely available. So you basically have more chances to make mistakes because, yeah, it's if your business is interesting, you always somehow find some investor somewhere. Now, this is not the case anymore. I mean, it probably won't be the case anymore. So what are the best practices in that case is really when you recruit your sales, it's actually the strategy matters much more than the fact or the act of recruiting the sales, right? Because if you recruit 5 salespeople, you need to have their playbook perfectly ready. You need exactly to know how they're going to sell it, at which pricing, what are the different scenarios, the type of customers, etc. And ultimately, what people would start measuring is okay, what is the let's say sell efficiency of your company or of the recruit that you have done. And the thing is, if you look at the current, I mean, pre-COVID businesses, like some of the scale-up, they have really bad sales efficiency because the strategy was very average, and they just recruited a lot of people to grow and to expand, right? So this is definitely something that we think would change, and in fact, like for us when we evaluate the opportunities, I think this is also something important. We're going to make sure that the founders, if they pitch a business post-Series A and they're looking at scaling their sales team, we make sure that they understand what it takes to scale a sales team, not just recruiting people, but actually how do you organize a team, how do you set up the pre-sales, the sales, the playbook, etc., for instance. And obviously, there are not many profitable startups, but let's say path to profitability becomes also more important. But obviously there's one interesting aspect about profitability is that if you're profitable, you're kind of safe, right? You don't need external cash. This for sure, but I would say behind this profitability is more like for us really finding a business model that works, that would probably become profitable at some point, even if you grow very fast or scale, right? And the second aspect about, let's say, the changes that are going to come, like you mentioned, like Black Lives Matters and these type of things, we are expecting, I won't be able to predict them, but we're expecting a lot of them coming because like across all the interviews we've done in the recent weeks, mainly with like CEOs of large corporates within the industry, etc., to sort of understand how they approach the changes. One of their biggest, one of their worries, like I think it was the number one, is really social unrest within their own company. And this is really tied to the fact that the blue worker class has been quite neglected in terms of innovation, like for quite a long time. And now suddenly everyone realized that they've been the one who actually allowed everyone to go through the lockdown phase, right? And I think like this is also an important aspect for people to monitor because it's definitely something very present there. UK had riots a few days ago. This is like, never seen. France already had the yellow jacket recently. You see that in Germany, it's already happening. So these type of things are probably going to happen. And I think like for startups, it's also really important to pay attention to those aspects. But for startups, I guess it's more making sure that their own team, that they respect really the diversity aspects, etc.
Yeah, and I think that's a really valuable point around, it's true that, it's easy for us to look at these situations and say, okay, these have come out of the blue, but they haven't really. These are cumulative events, which are, in some cases, things will just come out of the blue, COVID, but, the Black Lives Matter movement has been going on, for, hundreds of years. And we're talking about sort of culmination of sort of inequalities, which are sort of coming to a fore there. And I guess thinking about how that reflects on businesses, and, you mentioned sort of, inclusivity, you mentioned diversity, are there, going back to that sort of point you raised about good managers have become even more important during the crisis, right? And people have not only stuck with good managers, but I think that has really helped to ground, I guess, the successful companies from the unsuccessful ones to some extent, right? And how easily you can retain your staff, how you can keep them motivated, how you keep them, continue to work on your startup and kind of drive business. What are the other things that you have seen which you think might be lessons which startups should think about as far as, recruitment, diversity, culture, mental health? We've spoken about these issues for so long now, but do you think, has this current sort of, the last 6 months really made a difference? Do you think those things will stick? Are they important? Will they make a difference?
So again, it's like, I hope they would stick. Yeah, I do hope, but I do think they would stick because it's a bit, it's like the Darwin law in full force. It's like bad managers are going to lose their job and the good ones are going to stay. I'm actually quite serious about that. I've seen startups changing their management team because some of them couldn't manage the lockdown. So, those who actually didn't work well with their team, they just removed them. And we actually do see the same in corporates. In factories, for instance, like a lot of corporates, noticed that middle managers in manufacturing plants are totally useless because those ones were remote. They were not on the floor, like the workers were going, but then the productivity even raised, right? So a lot of this type of, let's say, observation, I think are going to lead to some fundamental changes in the way how teams and organizations are managed. And again, it's like this type of things for us is like, if it lasts long enough, it would become a habit, and ultimately it would sort of kick in and let's say become a new trend. I mean, for this type of topic, at least that's how we see it. So hopefully we do think that, I mean, hopefully, I think because the sort of phase 2 of the crisis is going to last for some time, like for an unknown time, basically, I do think this would ultimately be long enough for this type of, let's say, things to become habits.
Yeah.
So yeah, rather positive.
I hope so too. I think it's always a bit of a challenge, because when we're talking about introducing some of these things which are around building great cultures in startups, you know, and you know this better than anyone, you know, there's never enough time, there's never enough money, there are never enough people. And it's often these types of things, you know, looking at your culture, looking at your recruitment practices, looking at, you know, diversity in your teams, the mental health support for your teams. That is one of those things which sometimes can be easy to put to the bottom of the list. And I think if anything, you know, hopefully the past few months have shown how much that helps you to build a resilient business, which even through the ups and downs will retain your talent, will keep people motivated, and hopefully, you know, help you to continue to grow your business despite the sort of the difficult circumstances.
Yeah, because just to add one more point, so one thing that a lot of startups are facing right now is that, again, it's like, although it's you know, most people are planning for an economic downturn, and most people shouldn't be leaving their job because, you know, like the job safety is not there anymore. We actually do think we do see some startups who really struggle to retain their top talent, because a lot of people during this phase just, you know, reflected a lot about the way they live, the way they work, if they really like what they're doing. And if it's not, some people are actually quitting their job, right? To those who sort of confident enough to find a job regardless what the economic situation, they actually do quit their job. So it's actually a challenge for startups, even post-lockdown phase, to retain some of the top talents. So definitely we think that all the management, the good management aspect is going to be very important.
And thinking about that from, I guess, the other side, the companies who are doing that well, the startups and scale-ups who are sort of, you know, have successfully navigated the past few months, have retained their talent, who might be still looking to hire because they've, you know, still got their investment and they've got money to spend. What tips would you share for them around, you know, taking advantage of what might be actually a very interesting talent landscape? You know, there might be some very qualified, sort of interesting people on the market who are looking for those opportunities with companies who can give them more than just, you know, an 8 till 7, I guess, is rather than 9 to 5, what is often with the startups. You know, what would you sort of, I guess, recommend to companies who are in that fortunate position, as far as how to take advantage of that?
In fact, I don't know if I have anything to recommend, because it's actually really a great time for those companies. And we see some companies, I mean, including in our portfolio, that if you look at the job markets pre-COVID, like especially in London, it was so hard to recruit because you have all the Google, Microsoft, Facebook, everyone is there, and, you know, just take away the best talents. And now they can recruit, like, you know, as they please. So I don't know if I have like any recommendation. I think it's even more important to, like, at that time, obviously you have people who just want a job, and in fact, maybe like, yeah, that would be probably my only recommendation, is like for startups, most startup, you don't want people who just want a job, right? You really want the top talents, and the people that you would actually find who are looking for a position right now, you have a lot of people, like even more than before, who are, you know, just looking for a job. So it's like, it's about, you know, how do you identify those who really fit your culture, those who are going to really thrive in your organization. So again, it comes down to, you know, good management, etc. But trying to identify the passion in the future recruits, I think that's even more important, because it's going to differentiate those who fit the company and those who don't.
Amazing, thank you. So I've got sort of, I guess, one more sort of main question, and then we'll absolutely sort of open up to the audience as well if they've got any questions as well. But my one, as I sort of wrap up, and we've talked a little bit about these, how companies can think differently, how they can position themselves. If we think back to, I know it's hard to believe, but think back to a pre-COVID world, right? Think back to sort of end of last year. One of the big topics that a lot of companies were facing was around sustainability, and looking at sort of ecological sustainability. How do we solve these sort of really gigantic issues which are still there? Despite COVID, we have still not solved the sustainability issue on the planet, and there's still work to be done. And I think startups and scale-ups have a huge role to play in that, and building businesses which can be self-sustaining as well as sustainable into the future. How do we support startups? How do startups sort of think about that going forwards? Is it something that they can afford to still think about? And even thinking about simple things like, I don't know, the use of disposable cutlery and stuff like that. We were all moving to metal straws, and plastic was going away. But now, especially with sort of the COVID environment, I wonder if sort of disposable sort of aspects and thinking about just what is safe and what is sound, and we just focus on that becomes more important. Do you think that we still have capacity to think about these big issues like sustainability going forwards?
So again, it's like not what I think, but what I observe right now. People do think much more about it. And again, this is, I think, like one of it would take a few months for us to really verify what we have observed and also some of our assumptions. But if we look at our sort of clean tech portfolio, like the company working in sustainable energy, etc., like they are coming out of the crisis stronger. So they are part of this 5 to 8% of startups who actually saw a positive impact. And it's more, I mean, I agree. It's like now, everyone needs to wear those masks. I mean, most of them should be recyclable, but, it's still a disposable thing. But you see, people are, making their own tissue masks that they can wash because they don't want to throw them. I mean, it's actually becoming a new fashion trend. Like you have a fashion company doing sort of those fashionable masks, etc. So, but the thing is, if we look at the globally, like a lot of consumers, like we saw that, for instance, in the food delivery. If you just look at the numbers and see like those like restaurants who actually have those either recyclable or like cardboard packaging for the food, they actually had much more traction during that lockdown period. So if you look at those small details, and at the moment these are only small details that we have seen, we don't have any like sort of aggregated figures, etc. The example I gave with the electric cars earlier, like we do believe that consumers actually react even in a stronger way towards sustainability, because it's really funny because we did some interviews and we talked to recently a company selling solar panels, so nothing special, solar panels for houses, etc. And they say that, I mean, during lockdown, they were in lockdown, so they couldn't go and install solar panels, but they actually had a big raise of demands because, people just told them, yeah, it's like, I want solar panels because, we're destroying the planet, and COVID for them was actually a sign, even, it may not be related, we don't know. But people just, make this sort of link. And a lot of people we have also interviewed, like they basically say, okay, everything in terms of damage from climate change that we've been told, we don't know. Still, some people are skeptical, but at least seeing how COVID went, they think that, okay, it may actually be possible. So that's at least the way we see the thing at the moment. Like for companies in sustainability, I mean, similar to others, we're really asking them and helping them to identify the specific customer segments who would actually adopt whatever product they are providing, because there are quite a lot of it there. And the last aspect is, I mean, maybe the last one on this is that even the oil company are starting to say that, it's probably the end of oil and we need to seriously prepare the next stage. And this is not a light statement, right? Because a lot of them have been saying for years, yeah, oil is going to be there for the next 50 years anyway. Now they're suddenly reversing, and you see that they're actually also taking action as well. So, I mean, I believe it's a sign as well.
Amazing, amazing. That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Jerome. So I've got, I think, a couple of extra questions here. We'll see how we go with time. First one, some companies have announced that they're going to be offering remote working for their staff after COVID as well. Do you see this as an opportunity or as a challenge for startups and scale-ups?
So a bit of both, but definitely for first an opportunity, because I mean the first thing is a lot of people have seen that is that at least like for the first 4 weeks of confinement, when everyone was remote, most companies were much more productive. So it's simply, I mean, if you don't need to commute, you have actually more time to work, you know. And I mean, also during the lockdown, there was not much things to do except from working. That's probably the aspect as well. So I do think because of this, most companies would sort of trust remote working a bit more and allow more, let's say, leeway or freedom to their employees to actually stay remote. This being said, I think lockdown has already also as well shown the downside of remote. So if you have a team which is completely remote, it's much harder to create a culture, to have a good working environment, to also just understand what is the motivation status of your different employees. So I think, I mean, I'm expecting a lot more company to, let's say, accept remote, but I'm not expecting anyone to actually make remote as a new norm, because I personally don't think it should be the new norm. I think it should be something, it should be introduced to a sort of increase the flexibility, etc. But I do believe a big part of the work would actually more remain on site.
Amazing, amazing. Thank you. And I guess I think we can just squeeze in one last question before we do the final wrap up. And this one is, I guess, taking you back to your entrepreneur days. If you were to go back into entrepreneurship and to start a new business now, what would that business be?
That's a tough question, because I don't have any big idea right now.
Come on, the secret's Jerome. What should they?
I do think I will start something in sustainability. Like something maybe, I don't know, related to, you know, allow something that would give people the power to just consume whatever, I mean, as they are doing today, but in fact having a positive impact on the planet. Yeah, more precise like this, I have no idea, but that's a topic that definitely I've been looking for a very long time. So I think like if I create a new business, which would probably happen one day, it would probably be around that topic. But at least like I believe that this is actually a really good timing, like right now, or like in the next 6 months, I don't know, precisely because we're starting to see like some big movement in terms of consumer trends. So
amazing, thank you. And just as we wrap up, I always like to kind of finish with a recommendation or something to do. If you were to be passing on a recommendation to any of the people who are either leading or working at scale-ups and startups who are on the call right now, what would be your sort of top 3 things that they should do to prepare as they're sort of coming out of COVID?
Yeah, I think probably a few things that I've already mentioned today. I think like the one thing that I'm telling, I mean, every single one of my own CEOs in my portfolio is really like every morning when you wake up, ask yourself if you or your business is relevant today and tomorrow, in 6 months, etc. And I think this is actually the main job of a CEO, to ask himself or herself like this question, like again and again, like every single morning. It is extremely important in the sort of past few months during the lockdown, because as we mentioned, like things were changing. But the thing is, even more important going forward, this is now the time to catch the next big trend, even for established startups, right? So this is potentially the opportunity to actually create something even bigger than what they have envisioned initially. So probably like a first advice. And I think that the 2 other advice, we've already talked a lot about it. One is understand your customer, like really, really well, like nearly, if it's possible, every single one of your customers at a personal level, you know, because this has saved so many companies right now. It's really like incredible when you see all of those different startups and how some manage to pivot and some just can't. Those who managed is because they understood their customers and they were asking themselves to see if they were relevant or not. And the last aspect is really any aspect related to good management, development of soft skills. I mean, in our fund, for every founder, we always pair them with advisor to coach them on soft skills. So sort of personal development and continuous improvement of founders. But I think like overall within the startup landscape, I don't think many founders have sort of those, let's say, this support in terms of development of soft skills. And I think like in the next phase, this is probably going to make a difference as well between, just people who, all the people who are going to arrive in the startup world. It's like, okay, should I pick this startup or the other, right? Because if you look at, myself, even as an entrepreneur, it's so difficult to get the top talent because a lot of them, they come and they know they have the choice between one of the tech giant or like whatever corporate or a startup. So the first question they're asking themselves is always, but should I join a company that may not be there in 18 months? Because that's basically the nature of startup. And most of the time, a lot of them, I mean, you get the recruit because they love some aspect of the company. They either the mission, but very often the work environment and the team itself. So I think like it's going to become even more important in the next few phases when you have sort of this big competition for startup talent coming. So.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Jerome. That was an absolute pleasure to have that conversation. Or, I could go for hours, but it's always one of those things where, you only have a certain amount of time. If anyone has any other questions to either about sort of Jerome or about Microsoft for Startups or Aster Capital, do feel free to drop us a line. You can find us on Twitter as well as obviously on LinkedIn and all on our websites and stuff as well. But thank you very much, Jerome. Really, really enjoyed that discussion and obviously look forward to future discussions as well.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Thank you.